I need a suit.
Echo is a stealth action game developed by Ultra and released in 2017. It would be the only game they would ever release, as Echo didn't do too well financially, and the studio was forced to close down after it was released. I'm not really surprised it didn't sell that well, as I don't see a lot of people talk about Echo. It doesn't help that there's two other games called Echo, the one with the funny dolphin and the one with the less funny animals. Let's move on. The premise of the game is pretty simple. You play as a girl named N, who has just spent the last 100 years in stasis. She was traveling to some coordinates to find a palace, which, spoilers, she finds, with the help of an AI named London, who really doesn't care for her. She's traveling there to save the life of a man named Foster, who's London's friend and who saved N's life. And that's pretty much it for now. We'll talk about the story later, but for now, let's move on to one of the better parts of the game, the graphics. Starting with the environments, the scale and detail of everything is just insane. Between all the gold and glass everywhere and everything being polished to a mirror sheen, it all feels very opulent. But something feels off about it all. Between the room design and the furniture placement, it all feels like it was sort of designed by a robot. Which, given that the palace is the entire planet, probably isn't too far from the truth. That's how you end up with stuff like the giant staircase, the banquet hall that goes on forever, and the room that's suspended over a death pit. The death thing is probably symbolic, but I'll get into that later. Even with how alien all the interior decoration is, it all feels very luxurious. The decadence is perfectly contrasted by the trips you take back outside. As you see the lattice of metalwork arching into the darkness, and you realize you're going so deep the sun's light isn't even reaching you anymore. The scope and design of it all raises a lot of questions, like, who built this? Why is it all here? Could this game get any brighter if it tried? The story answers some of these questions, but not all of them. Seriously though, there was a couple parts of this game I thought my corneas were gonna burst into flames. Even with how bright the game can get, it's still extremely impressive how well this team was able to do given its size. I'd highly recommend checking out the portfolios of the artists and the level designer if you want to see some concept art and some screenshots of the game. The environments bring some gameplay issues with them, which I'll get more into later, but for now, just remember that I said this is a stealth game. Narrowing the scope and looking at the character models, there's exactly one character, you, with varying degrees of completeness. I'm willing to give the brightness a pass because of how much N's model contrasts against the environment. It provides a lot of visual clarity, and it helps you navigate around the enemies easier. There is a catch though. One of the core concepts of this game is that the enemies learn from you, but they stop learning while the lights are out. So when the lights are on, even though you have to police your actions, you can still see the enemies pretty easily. But when it's dark, you can do whatever you want, at the cost of being able to see the enemy. It's an interesting dynamic, and it adds some depth to the gameplay. I just wish the UI contrasted as well as the characters do. Making your HUD light blue in a game with this much white in it is a bold design choice. The HUD displays important information when you need it most, so I guess that's all I can ask for. Overall though, I think the characters look good and they contrast well enough against the environment, for the most part. There's not much more to say graphically. I could talk about the environment some more, but then I'd just be repeating myself. You know what else is a bit repetitive? The level architecture. I know I just gushed about how pretty everything is, and it is all pretty, but there's only really one type of level archetype used here, and it's the palace type. And as much as I appreciate the level design, there's only so many times I can see glass chandeliers and cushioned chairs before I start to feel a little crazy. Thankfully, the game is short enough that this doesn't become a big issue. I just would have liked a bit more variety is all. I still like how everything looks, and there's a very serene atmosphere to be found here. Of course, as we all know, graphics are only one half of the atmosphere equation, and I think the audio supports the graphics very well. Starting with music, a lot of it uses these chimes and glassy sounding wind instruments. It's very tranquil, and it transforms the palace into this otherworldly place, and it almost feels like the afterlife. That is, until you have enemies nearby. Once you're in any amount of danger, the game will layer on this pulsing synthetic beat on top of the existing ambience, and it's dynamic too. The more attention you attract, the more desperate the soundtrack will sound, as if it's matching your character's growing anxiety.
Only 4 more to go.
Unfortunately, I think the music shares the same issue as the visuals, in that there's a lot of repetition. I'm not even sure if there's more than a couple of tracks, although I could just be going crazy. Let's move on to the other star of the auditory show, the voice acting. The actors might be a little more unknown than typical, but they do a really good job here. Without getting too much into the story, the two actors play off each other really well, and there's a lot of emotion in their voices, even if that emotion is vitriol.
I don't know if you noticed that there were no other exits from this pit than the big door. How I hope the scepter will magically make it open.
It will work.
Must be nice always feeling that the world will act in your favor. It doesn't, though. My guess is that you will learn this momentarily.
With the way the two go off on each other, you can tell they just barely tolerate each other, mostly out of a shared respect for Foster, but that'll come later. For now, just know that the voice acting is good. As for the sound effects, they're alright. There's a couple of things in particular I want to mention, but for the most part, they fit where they need to, and that's fine by me. When a cycle starts to wind down, the game will start playing this droning noise to let you know that the power's about to go out. That way, you'll know roughly how much time you have before you can start to take free actions. You'll also get an auditory warning when the power's about to cycle again, giving you enough time to hopefully get to a good position. Now's a good time to talk about how the cycles actually work. The main pattern of the game is pretty simple. In areas where you encounter enemies, you have a period of light, and then a period of dark, and then a reset where the whole thing cycles through again. The amount of light time you have will vary, but I found it to be around a minute or so. And during this time, the palace will capture any actions you take. And by any action, I mean basically anything that isn't just walking around. Things like sprinting, firing your gun, or playing the piano will all get captured by the palace. Any actions you take during this light period will be available for enemies during the next cycle, so pick your actions carefully. However, during the dark period, you can take any action you want without the palace detecting you. You can afford to be more aggressive during this period and take actions that would normally be too dangerous. At the end of a dark period, the palace will reset, which will also reset the enemy's awareness of you. This can bail you out of a few sticky situations. Aside from managing your actions, you also have to manage your resources. A few of your actions will incur either a stamina or an energy cost. Stamina will recharge on its own, but you'll need to find these energy posts in order to fill your energy slots back up. Either way, you'll want to keep a close eye on these resources, as the last thing you need is to be surrounded with no way of getting out. Aside from your standard movement options, walking, running, opening doors, you have a few tools at your disposal. Let's start with the most obvious defense tool, your gun. It takes 1 energy to shoot, but it can go through an infinite number of enemies as long as they're in range. The gun also has a riot mode, which I would use if it was free to use, but as it stands, if I'm going to use my gun, I might as well be shooting to kill. You can also push enemies, which won't help you if you're being swarmed. There's also the classic stealth takedown, which takes some time, but it does outright kill your enemies. The game claims this makes some noise, but I'm pretty sure the game is lying. You can also find these glass orbs around the map, which you can use to kill or distract your enemies. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the environment you can interact with, which the palace will register. You can use this to your advantage, as enemies interacting with this stuff will be busy wasting their time instead of looking for you. So how do all these systems work together in practice? Well, it's kind of messy. Let me explain. With the way everything works, the game can be pretty trivial at points. Let's look back at the actions the palace can register. Over here on the right, you've got actions that you'd really rather not be recorded by the palace, things like shooting and sprinting. And over here on the left, you have actions that really don't matter that much if they're registered, things like crouching, opening doors, and doing stealth takedowns. Most actions in the game fall pretty neatly into these two categories. Unfortunately, they also fit into another couple of categories. Things you'll be doing a lot of, and things you won't be doing a lot of. Okay, so if these actions are good for the enemy, they must be good for you too, right? Well, not really. There's not very many scenarios where sprinting somewhere will help you in the long run. And as for your gun, you only get a handful of shots, whereas after the next cycle, every single enemy will have as many shots as they want. Don't forget, falling from certain heights also requires this energy, so you can be screwed if you back up into a ledge with no place to go. The trouble is, stealth is just too reliable of an option for this whole enemy learns from you mechanic to be of any impact. The enemy AI just isn't prepared for how sneaky you are, and well, you're you. You have a giant advantage against the enemy because you're capable of thinking. Overall, it feels like a bit of a letdown. There's not enough to stop you from doing stealth takedowns over and over again. Except for the last chapter of the game, where things get a little, interesting. Up ahead is the spoilers interchange. If you want to take the off-ramp, go to here.
The subject lies down on a marble surface with a strange silver pattern. And the silver unfolds, pierces the skin, and slithers inside. In about half an hour, it consumes everything. And all that remains is an empty slab of marble and a newly formed cube.
No.
He called it the translation.
Okay, so there's some explaining to do. I mentioned that there's a character named Foster early in the video. Well, you've been looking at him the whole time. He's the red cube on the back of N's suit. Foster was translated, as the game says, on one of these silver slabs, and London and N have gone to the palace to find a way to revive him from this state. N is optimistic. London is less so.
Yes, I had a very good look at that while you were asleep. I think you're in for a disappointment. Nothing suggests any sentience. No interface to access the thing, nor any reason to do so. There's nothing in there. It's just a pretty cube.
So the story is about these three characters and the relationship between them. N with her optimism, London with his realism, and Foster with his absence. Overall, I'd say the writing is pretty good, but the game does have that problem where there's designated story time zones, and sometimes the dialogue can basically boil down to you suck and no you. The game also likes to throw big science words at you, but that's kind of to be expected for a sci-fi game. Still, there's plenty of great moments, and I thought the writing was at least compelling enough to get to the end. The broad strokes of the story aren't anything to write home about. It's basically just about the two main characters, but there are a couple of things I do want to talk about. First, the peak of the conflict. It happens after N loses Foster, and London finally has a breakdown.
Could you stop bickering for a moment? I need to find another way back in there.
You're so sure of yourself, N. You've seen but a glimpse of time, and yet consider yourself the answer to the eternal questions of life and death.
It's a great moment, and it shows a lot about what the two characters are really about. Everything after this is great too. They start to bond, even if only a little bit. This late into the game, you've gotten a chance to know the characters and you start to really care for them. Which brings us to the end, which feels abrupt. I didn't know how short the game was on my first playthrough, so it kind of took me by surprise.
Take care, Foster. Of London as well.
And that's pretty much how the game ends. You get to the center of the palace, you trade your life for Foster's, roll credits. It's not a bad ending, but this isn't that long after N and London have their big fight. The game was building up to this, but I guess I just feel like the main conflict is a little unresolved. I guess it's thematically appropriate if the level names are anything to go by, which I won't be getting into those since I'm not really good with that sort of metaphorical thinking. Echo is a game that thrives on its atmosphere. The whole thing has a very dreamlike quality to it, and until they start putting these in games, this is as close to a dream as we're getting. Even with how middling the gameplay is, if you like the kind of atmosphere this game has, I say give it a try. The game is short enough that it doesn't get too stale by the end, and if you do end up liking it, there's plenty of collectibles for you to find throughout. I don't know if it's worth $25 though. Maybe wait for a sale or something. I wish more games would use the AI learning mechanic, and I think this game is a good start. That about wraps it up for this video. I've got a couple more games in the pipeline I'm trying to review, and I promise I haven't forgotten about Riven. I just kind of have to be in the right mindset to play that kind of game. Hopefully with my new recording schedule, I'll be getting more videos out sooner. The next video should be Zorch, which is definitely an experience. Until then, thanks for watching.